Along with everyone else apparently this centenary year, we're going to look at some aspects of the First World War. This video is mainly about the Western Front in France and Belgium between 1914 and 1918. With France in the west and Russia in the east both prepared to support one another if attacked, Germany's military obsession in the years up to World War I became how to knock out one army before dealing with the other. The Schlieffen Plan of 1905 was to attack France first by moving huge numbers of German troops quickly through the flatlands of neutral Belgium and northern France, and then swing round to take Paris and crush the French army from behind against the Franco-German border. All this was to happen within 6 weeks, leaving just enough time to move most of the army east to confront the Russian army, which the German High Command reckoned would be much slower to mobilise. Kaiser Wilhelm II and his general staff assumed that tiny Belgium would not dare to resist the might of the German army. Britain would not honour a 75-year-old agreement to protect Belgium, and that Britain's small standing army would arrive too late to make any difference anyway. Unfortunately, all these assumptions proved to be wrong, and by October 1914 and the First Battle of Ypres, the German advance had been halted, and some pessimists in the German High Command, including Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn, were already beginning to worry. In all, there were 3 major battles during the war at Ypres, and it's easy to see why. The area was crucial to both sides. Allied access to the French Channel ports to the south, and the huge German railway system and the U-boat pens at Zeebrugge to the north. The first battle for Ypres was the first full-on experience for either side in the horrors of modern defensive trench warfare. In contrast to those who said the war would be over by Christmas, Secretary of State for War Lord Kitchener's brutal assessment was that the winner of the war would be the last country with 1 million troops left standing. As if to prove his point, in just over 30 days the Battle of Ypres produced over 250,000 casualties and a stalemate. It shocked both sides. Kindermord, it was called in Germany, murder of the innocents. Many of the casualties had been teenage reservists. The Belgian army and the small British expeditionary force of trained regular soldiers, which had held up the original German advance in August and September, were effectively wiped out. One of those who did survive to fight another day and another war was Rifleman Adolf Hitler, whose company in the 16th Bavarian Reserve Regiment was reduced from 250 men to 42 in just 20 days. The famous camaraderie between the armies in the Christmas truce of 1914, where soldiers from both sides sang carols, swapped small presents and even played football matches in no man's land, didn't last beyond the early months of 1915 at Ypres, after the Germans' first use of poison chlorine gas. But it wasn't a one-sided affair. The Allies began using chlorine and phosgene gas a few months later. A gas mask became part of every soldier's kit. 1915 on the Western Front was characterised by digging in. Trench systems were constructed right across France from the Swiss border to the Belgian coast, often with defensive and counter-attack reserves in trenches kilometres behind the front line trenches. But both sides struggled with the same problem: how to break through enemy defences with its machine gun and artillery support, often using not much more than soldiers' bodies as weapons. The casualties mounted. In the second battle for Ypres in May, there were another 120,000 casualties. But the real carnage was saved for 1916. The British, French and Russians had decided at Chantilly in Paris in December 1915 on an all-out summer offensive on both fronts to try and break the German and Austrian lines. The 3 major battles of that year, the Somme and Verdun in France, and the Brusilov offensive in modern Ukraine, resulted in over 4 million casualties. Britain, the only country without conscription, originally wasn't prepared for this scale of slaughter. As its small professional army was being destroyed at Ypres in 1914, men were already enlisting in Kitchener's new army to form PALS battalions, where friends and neighbours could sign up to fight together in the same units. Initially 30,000 men enlisted every day, 1 million by the end of the year. Lord Kitchener's "Your Country Needs You" poster campaigns became legendary and inspired many imitations. But what originally seemed like a good idea had a nasty kick. On the first day of the Somme offensive on July the 1st, 1916, for instance, the British sustained over 60,000 casualties in just a few hours. The Accrington PALS battalion from Lancashire was almost wiped out in 20 minutes. 585 killed or injured from a total of 700. The Leeds PALS lost 750 out of 900, some from the same families. Whole communities in Britain were plunged into grief. Enthusiasm for enlistment had already evaporated and conscription introduced. By early 1917, Germany's efforts on both fronts had taken its toll in casualties and supplies. So it was decided to build a shorter defensive line behind the front near the Somme and retreat there to release men for the Eastern Front and let unrestricted submarine warfare and strategic bombing by Zeppelin and bomber wear the Allies down. This line was named after Paul von Hindenburg, the new German Chief of Staff, and was completed, including reinforced concrete bunkers, telephone system and its own railway, by March 1917. An Allied attempt to break through this line was made at the Battle of Cambrai in November 1917. This was famous for its early use of combined arm tactics, involving infantry, artillery, over 400 tanks and air power, to overwhelm defensive positions. Even the cavalry corps was involved. Although the final result of the battle was inconclusive, the initial success ensured it would become a model for future warfare. The British had used tanks since September 1916 to overcome the problem of trench defences. The strange shape of this 1917 Mark IV tank enabled it to crush barbed wire, cross over open trenches, and shield infantry following behind. In 1918, the French had developed the mobile Renault FT, which, with its rear engine and fully rotating turret gun, became the prototype for all later tank designs. By returning to unrestricted submarine warfare, the Germans were gambling heavily on a US warning over the loss of 128 American lives after the torpedoing by U-boat of the liner Lusitania in 1915. The gamble was, if the US did enter the war, would there be enough time for Germany to bring Britain to its knees through lack of supplies before large numbers of trained US troops arrived in Europe? It was a close-run thing. Within 6 months in early 1917, up to 25% of shipping bound for Britain was sunk, compared with just 9 German U-boats. After losing 7 merchant ships of their own, the US finally declared war on Germany on April the 6th, 1917. One factor in the Germans' favour was that the US only had a small army of 200,000 men, with no expertise in modern warfare or logistics, and while the Allied armies were desperate for more men, they needed trained soldiers, not raw recruits. Conscription and training were going to take time, which the Allies were running out of. In the spring offensive of 1918, bolstered by divisions from the east after the collapse of Russia, the Germans made one last push to close off the Channel ports before the bulk of the US Army arrived. But whilst territory was gained, it failed in its objectives and lost too many experienced troops and fuel and munition supplies in the process. The situation on the Western Front was now so dire that the average age of all combatants was just 20 years. When US troops joined the war, they found themselves fighting alongside British and French troops not long out of school. Lord Kitchener's frightening prediction was not far away from coming true. By summer the tide was turning, and over 1 million US troops under General John Pershing joined in the final offensive to push the German army back to the frontier. Pershing had insisted that US troops wouldn't be split up between the British and the French, but kept under his command. He did let some, such as the 369th Infantry Regiment, go, however. This was a regiment of segregated African American troops from Harlem in New York, initially used for simple labour services such as stores handling, but then seconded to the desperate French Fourth Army as a combat unit and, for the first time, as equals. Here it got the name as the Harlem Hellfighters and won a regimental Croix de Guerre from the French and 171 individual honours for valour. And while the Hellfighters joined the other Allied troops, including Canadians, Australians and New Zealanders, in pushing the demoralised German army back to the Rhine, the regiment's marching band under Jim Rees Europe was becoming famous for introducing jazz and ragtime to war-weary Europeans. By October, Kaiser Wilhelm had been told by the Supreme Army Command that the situation facing Germany was hopeless and that a full military collapse was imminent. The armistice between Germany and the Allies was signed at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918, but the Kaiser had already abdicated and Germany was already involved in a year-long revolutionary war, ending with the formation of the Weimar Republic in 1919. As for the Hellfighters, they hadn't been permitted to take part in the December 1917 farewell parade, but the 369th Infantry Regiment became the leading unit in the New York Victory Parade when they arrived home in February 1919. Well, that's all for now. Thanks for watching.